December 14, 1812. The frozen lip of the Neman River in what had been, 6 months earlier, the threshold of a dream. A Prussian general stands on the bank and watches what is left of the greatest army Europe has ever seen painfully cross back into Poland. Not months of marching heroics, no triumphant trumpets, just silence, the whisper of wind over snow, and rows of men who look like ghosts wearing the tatters of uniforms. 6 months ago, 685,000 human beings stepped off those banks and walked east with flags aloft and drums striking out a confident rhythm. They expected a quick crown to their emperor's ambition, a single decisive season of war that would bend Russia to the will of France. Now fewer than 10,000 fit soldiers shuffle across the ice. In the slow days that follow, another 30,000 broken figures stumble over the crossing, skeletal, barefoot, wrapped in rags, some without digits, some without noses, many with faces disfigured by frost. They shuffle like survivors of a shipwreck, breathing through masks of frozen beard, eyes the hollow patent of men who have outlived everything else. What they left behind is too many stories in one landscape. Bodies frozen into drifts along 1,000 kilometers of road. The flat faces of drowned soldiers in swollen rivers, mass graves outside dusty towns, horses heaped by the roadside. The tally is obscene. More than 600,000 who didn't return. Some died from frostbite, some from disease, some from starvation, some from musket balls, some by their own hand when despair became the only escape. Entire regiments vanished. Units that set out in full strength returned as handfuls of men. This was, in its day, the greatest military catastrophe Europe had seen. It is the story of Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia, a story we tend to tell with a single, easy villain called General Winter. That explanation is comforting, almost cinematic, nature arrayed against men, but it's incomplete, and when we make it the whole story, we miss the human choices, the pride, miscalculation, and strategic blindness that put hundreds of thousands in the path of that cold. If you let me, I'll take you back to the beginning of this disaster. Not to the frozen river that marks the end, but to the rooms, the maps, and the conversations where the decisions were made. To the summer heat and the months when the rot began, because the campaign was dying long before frost arrived. By 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte was a man whose name reshaped the map of Europe. In barely 13 years he had become general, consul, emperor. He crowned himself in Notre Dame and sat where popes once presided. The French Empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Russian border, wrapped around Germany, extended down into the Italian peninsula, and elbowed into Spain. 70 million people in Europe were under his influence in one form or another. The largest European empire since Charlemagne. He had earned a reputation for genius in war. He crushed coalitions at Austerlitz and Jena. He remade armies, developed logistics, and moved men with a speed his opponents could not match. And yet even his genius had limits. After Trafalgar, the sea was for Britain. Napoleon, who could not invade Albion, attempted to strangle it economically. The continental system, imposed in 1806, forbade European states from trading with Britain. For 3 years Russia complied, but the policy was choking Russian commerce. Grain waited unsold in barns. Timber could not find buyers. Aristocratic fortunes shrank. By 1810, Russian ports began to admit British ships again. Napoleon took offense at more than the trade. He annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg in December 1810, a petty insult that landed like a slap in the face of Tsar Alexander. Statesmanship faltered into mutual provocation. Armies massed. By early 1812, the die was cast. The Emperor of the French would muster the greatest army Europe had ever seen and march east. What followed was a mobilization of impossible scale. Men were drawn from all over. French veterans, conscripts, Germans from the Confederation of the Rhine, Poles from the Duchy of Warsaw, Italians, Swiss, Croatians, Dutch, Portuguese, an imperial melange. Napoleon's insistence created armies within an army. The central mass under his direct control, a northern wing aimed at St. Petersburg, a southern wing to guard the flanks. They gathered along the Neman in late spring, and on June 23 and 24, 1812, the crossing began. It was a thunderous affair. Pontoons groaned. Boots beat. Dust clouds rose so thick the sun dimmed. Napoleon himself crossed with his imperial guard, the veterans whose presence steadied many a wavering moment. But the first problems appeared almost immediately. The roads of Lithuania were not French highways. They were tracks that turned to mud when summer storms washed them. The wagons sank. Artillery required men to manhandle it through bogs. The supply depots Napoleon had established months before began to fail simply because the system could not physically move the tonnage required. An army of hundreds of thousands devoured food and fodder at the rate of something close to a small city every day. The countryside could not feed them. Foraging parties scoured villages and found little. Where Napoleon had succeeded before, in Italy and Germany, he had done so on lands dense with population and production. Russia was wide and poor by comparison. Within days, horses were collapsing. Within a week, soldiers were underfeeding. Disease began to spread like smoke through a dry forest. Typhus from lice, dysentery from polluted water, the usual companions of armies living in filth and exhaustion. By the end of July, under the summer sun, the Grand Armée had lost staggering numbers. Reports indicate tens of thousands were already gone to disease and desertion before a major battle had been fought. Napoleon believed that a single decisive victory, the kind he had engineered time and again, would end the campaign. His marshals disagreed on the details but not on the hope. The Russians, led by two very different commanders, Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, cautious and strategic, and Prince Pyotr Bagration, fiercely brave and impatient, had a different plan. They withdrew. They burned. They took everything that could sustain an intruder and carried it away or set it ablaze. The French marched forward and found ash where supply had once been. Each step east lengthened their supply lines. Each step ahead drew them into deeper, less hospitable country. By mid-August, Smolensk burned as the Russians executed a fighting withdrawal. The French took the city, ransacked it, and found no salvation. Men were dying for lack of medicine, for lack of clean water, for lack of a bite of bread. At Borodino, a day of slaughter near the approaches to Moscow, both sides threw men into a meat grinder. For 12 hours in early September, cannon and musket and bayonet turned the fields into a macabre quilt of bodies. The Russians defended robust earthworks, the Bagration flèches, the great redoubt on Raevski's hill. French columns crashed into canister and volley after volley, capturing ground only to see it flow back under counterattacks. Napoleon withheld his elite reserve, the Imperial Guard, in the end. Historians argue over why. Was he ill? Was he cautious? Did he realize that even a decisive victory there would leave him unable to finish the campaign? The result was the same. Inconclusive victory that cost tens of thousands of men on both sides and left the Russian army unbeaten in spirit and essentially intact. The French won the field, but lost the campaign's decisive moment. Napoleon trudged into Moscow on September 14th and found a city emptied and then set on fire. The governor and others chose to destroy goods and buildings rather than allow them to feed the invader. The Kremlin stood, but around it, timber and merchant stores burned into a furnace of ruin. For 5 weeks, Napoleon waited for a reply he never received. He sent emissaries and messages that were returned unanswered. He sat in a ruined capital with an army that could not be fed. Supplies dwindled. The weather turned as autumn closed in. The Grand Armée's horses, the logistical backbone and the cavalry's pride, were dying by the thousands. Discipline frayed. Men, soaked from autumn rains and weakened by disease, began to freeze when temperatures dropped. Yet Napoleon lingered, convinced that occupation of a capital should force a negotiation, as had happened in other parts of Europe. Russia's Tsar Alexander had already chosen differently. The loss of Moscow was, painfully and deliberately, a price he was willing to pay. When the order to retreat finally came in mid-October, it was late. For 5 long weeks the army had squandered what little stockpiles it had. Retreat down the road they had come across scorched earth, stripped the route of any remaining resources. Beaten routes now turned to an open graveyard. The first snow fell on October 26th. By November the temperature was plunging. Men had thrown away heavy coats to make room for loot in Moscow, silver and icons that would do nothing for survival. And now they found themselves without shelter. Horses, lacking fodder, ate bark and then died. Cannons and wagons were abandoned. Disease finished what lack of food had begun, and the Cossacks and peasant partisans circled and picked off the stragglers like carrion birds. You've heard of the Battle of the Beresina, the desperate crossing in late November, near a village where engineers scoured up planks and pilings from villages and built 2 trestle bridges under bullet and shell, where men in freezing water hammered posts in with bare hands until the bloody structure held long enough for some to cross. You've heard of bodies clogging the water, of screaming, of the collapse of the bridges into the river, and of Napoleon, who fled Moscow on December 5th, leaving his army behind. What often gets underplayed is that the Beresina was not the cause of the disaster so much as its harrowing punctuation. The campaign had already been dying of its own wounds, when on December 14, 1812, the survivors crossed the Neman back into Polish territory. What waited was a number so monstrous it is hard to feel. Fewer than 40,000 soldiers returned fit for service out of the near 700,000 that had entered Russia. Some estimates differ in their details, but the basic arithmetic is merciless. The losses were mostly non-combat: disease, starvation, exposure, desertion. Tens of thousands more were captured and marched into fields of exile. The Polish, the Bavarians, the Italians, the Germans, whole communities were hollowed out, their boys and fathers gone. So why did it happen? To reduce it to general winter is to tell a story of fate rather than choice. It removes blame. It is easier to say that nature did what nature always does than to say that people miscalculated. The truth is messier. The campaign failed because Napoleon overmatched his operational and logistical capability against a strategy of Russian endurance and scorched earth. Because he underestimated an opponent who could afford to trade space for time. Because strategic hubris blinded him to the arithmetic of supply. And because political pressure, the fear that any sign of weakness would unleash coalition forces, drove him to make the wrong choices at the wrong times. This isn't simply the story of one man's mistake. It's a lesson about the limits of power and the costs of overreach. When Napoleon marched into Russia, he was at the peak of his career. He had remade Europe. Each victory fed a conditional belief. Victories could be manufactured like clockwork, and enemies folded if you could show the right combination of force and speed. Time and terrain and an opponent's will were variables he had beaten before. Yet Russia offered a different kind of calculus: immensity and stubbornness. The Russians had the luxury of burning grain to the wind and retreating deeper into a country that could not be conquered by quick triumphs. Napoleon had the cost of maintaining the largest army Europe had ever seen. After the catastrophe, Europe sensed vulnerability. Old alliances that had shivered before the emperor's might now whispered of rebellion. Prussia, humiliated in 1806 and pressed into alliance, reacted to the news at the Neman with a daring move. The commander of the Prussian corps, Ludwig Yorck von Wartenburg, signed a convention with the Russians at Tauroggen and declared neutrality. That act, unauthorized as it was, sparked a political tide that would become the Sixth Coalition. Prussia rearmed. Austria watched and calculated. Sweden, Britain, Russia. The old order coalesced around the chance to roll back Napoleon's hegemony. The campaign's failure did more than kill soldiers. It created the conditions for the empire's fall. Napoleon was not finished. He raised an army in 1813 and fought genius campaigns in Germany. But the elastic of Europe had been stretched past its limit. At Leipzig in October 1813, the numerical advantage turned the tide. Napoleon, who had once beaten coalitions, now found himself facing a coalition with the patience to wait, the resources to rebuild losses, and the political will to replace soldiers the French could not reasonably replace. The March on Paris in 1814, the abdication, Elba, the brief return in 1815, and Waterloo all follow aftershocks from the Russian disaster. It would be melodramatic to say Russia was the only cause, but it was the decisive event in the unraveling. And what of the men, the individual souls who marched into what seemed to be a campaign of glory and returned as a fragment? They were more than numbers on a page. Letters and artifacts tell us the texture of the campaign. A corporal writing of 3 days without bread. A Polish lancer watching his mount die. A Bavarian conscript resigned to the knowledge he would never see his family again. This human toll reshaped communities. The demographic ripples went on for decades. Entire regions lost cohorts. Women and the elderly buried whole swathes of a generation that would not come home. If all of this feels bleak, that's because it is. But there is a value to seeing the truth, to understanding the concatenation of poor choices and harsh realities that produced catastrophe. The myths that simplify history into clean causes are comforting, but they blunt judgment. The real lessons are strategic and moral. The importance of logistics over gallantry. The centrality of realistic objectives. The perils of hubris. The need to understand your adversary as more than a copy of previous opponents. If you think you've read these lessons before, consider how often they repeat. Leaders intoxicated with past victory often ignore the arithmetic of capacity and the politics of the moment. The American and German invasions of Russia in later centuries echo the same hubris. Vietnam and more modern conflicts remind us that tactical wins are meaningless if they don't reinforce strategic viability. Now let me tell this story again, but with more of the scene, the human detail, and the kind of voice that sits you down beside a campfire and compels you to listen. This is not an academic lecture. This is a narrative crafted for a voiceover, measured, vivid, and humane. Imagine June 1812, dawn on the Neman. Fog hangs over the river like a shroud. Men form in rippling columns. Officers ride between them with maps that look smaller when held alongside the vastness they point at. The engineers set the pontoons with grim faces. Horses drink and snort and paw. Napoleon rides with his imperial guard across the floating bridges on June 24th. A small, compact figure in a great sweep of empire. The scene is noisy. Orders shouted, wood creaking, the river's current whispering. Local Lithuanians watch from a distance and do not come near. For many of the conscripts, this is the first time they see such a river. The first time they cross a country that does not belong to their language or their customs. From the start, the armies run on false assumptions. Napoleon's staff had prepared depots, Danzig, Königsberg, Warsaw, and dreamt of a machine of supply rolling effortlessly. In reality, the machine sputters. Supply convoy stuck in mud is like a clogged vein. The scale of the necessity, the tons of grain and fodder, the miles of wagons, turns into a nightmare long before the winter. Early rains turn the dirt roads into something that bites wheels and men. The imperial train cannot move fast enough. Foraging parties ride out and return with nothing but the memory of small villages where the barns have already been burned or emptied by a retreating population. The French troops start to eat less. Cup after cup of soup grows thinner. Horses that once were the army's pride become food, then refuse, then corpses. By the end of July, entire battalions are decimated by disease. You can almost map the decline by the way the columns thin each day. Fewer drums, fewer voices, more silence. This is when Russia's strategy begins to look like genius. Not because it is romantic, but because it is brutal and practical. Barclay and Bagration, different in temperament, execute a retreat that is not cowardly. It's a deliberate stripping of the landscape, denying the invader anything to feed upon. Villages are burned, wells fouled, livestock driven away. The French move into a corridor where every kilometer stretches their supply and weakens their men. They keep them moving until the army's metabolism, its system of food, horses, and morale, begins to fail. At Borodino, the army that remains is a fraction of what entered Russia. Yet the spectacle of battle there is enormous. The pulsing roar of artillery, the smoke thick enough to dull the sky, the sight of infantry columns advancing into a storm of canister shot. The Bagration flèches change hands 3 times. Men die in such numbers the ground feels like a loaf sliced depthless. Napoleonic columns are designed to break enemy formations with weight. Here they meet earthworks and the concentrated killing power of artillery and musketry. When the Imperial Guard remains in reserve, the moment for a hammer blow passes. The Russians withdraw in the dark. Moscow remains ahead. Moscow is not what Napoleon expects. It is a city of wooden houses, churches with onion domes that glitter, and merchants with warehouses of grain and goods. Yet the governor resolutely sets the city alight in a policy that reads like an act of last option. He is willing to surrender the symbol to deny the invader sustenance. The flames leap. The sky is orange. Soldiers stumble through burning streets and find ruin where there should be food. The psychological impact is profound. All the ways wars, ended in Europe, capture of a capital, surrender treaty, have been rewritten. Here, a sovereign is willing to accept the destruction of a capital rather than bow. Napoleon waits. He writes letters, sends envoys, and broods in the Kremlin. The marshals argue. The army eats through the resources that remain, and when those gone, it begins the retreat by the worn road to Smolensk. Then the snow starts. Men who have thrown away greatcoats for loot now find themselves in a thin jacket when the mercury dives. The first man you see frozen to death looks almost peaceful, but that betrays the horror. He's been dead so long his rigidity looks like sleep. Frostbite begins to take bits of bodies here and there, a toe, a finger, an ear. These are things that make life impossible. Limbs blacken. Amputations follow, often with no anesthesia but for a gulp of rum. The horses starve, the wagons are left, and the army's capability to move artillery and supplies disappears. Men begin to desert in trickles that become torrents. Some slip away to find villages and die there in private. The Cossacks pillage the periphery. The peasant partisans, ordinary folk who have watched barns burn and families destroyed, attack isolated foraging parties and wounded men in the night. The retreat becomes a series of small tragedies that accumulate into the larger catastrophe. Food runs out. Discipline collapses. Officers shoot looters and are praised and damned for it in the same breath. In towns like Smolensk, the depots contain less than expected. The promised salvation is a mangled dream. The final signal is the Beresina, a crossing where desperate engineering and sheer will allow some to escape, while thousands drown, freeze, or are cut down in the attempt. Napoleon leaves on a sleigh in early December. His departure is controversial then, and remains so now. He rides to Paris to secure reinforcements and political power, leaving his army to the fate of retreat. Some see it as necessary, others as abandonment. Whatever the moral judgment, the army is shattered. Prussia and other powers sense the moment and begin to shift. The case that follows, the ebb and flow of campaigns in 1813 and 1814, is influenced in no small measure by the punitive cost of the Russian debacle. 2 centuries on, we can sift this and take lessons, because history is a practice in cause and consequence. The campaign's failure is not reducible to weather. Winter hardened injuries, but did not make them. The army was dying before the frost. The plan was unsustainable. Its logistics were impractical. Its timescale misjudged. Napoleon's refusal to stop. His belief in the possibility of decisive victory at any point, and the political pressures to maintain the aura of invincibility combined into a series of choices that made the loss not just possible, but likely. There is also the human story buried in the statistics. The thrown-away futures, the towns that sent sons and received none, the wives who opened a letter that became a relic. Consider a Bavarian village that sent 60 young men and received 2 back. The demographic consequences ripple over generations. Fewer marriages, fewer children, farms abandoned, economies stunted. This is not abstractions. It is the texture of European life rewoven by absence. After the disaster, Napoleon raised new armies and fought with striking tactical brilliance. Lutzen and Bautzen in 1813 among them. But the horses were gone. The veterans decimated. The pool of military-age men narrowed. Europe did not accept the status quo. Prussia rearmed. Austria shifted. Britain continued to bankroll opposition. At Leipzig, the numbers overwhelmed him. Coalitions that had been fearfully fragile reorganized and struck with numerical superiority. The end in Paris and the abdication became theatrical footnotes in a ruin that had begun in 1812. If you listen closely to this story, there is a deeper lesson about the hairline between ambition and overreach. The same pattern appears again and again in history. A leader's string of victories encourages an expectation that can dull judgment. The move from tactical brilliance to strategic vulnerability is subtle. It is there when political goals outpace military means, when logistics, the dull arithmetic of how much food and how many horses, matter more than the romance of decisive battles. It is there when leaders cannot accept limits, and when advisors who argue for practicability are dismissed because they lack imagination or courage. I want to pause here and speak to the living, to the ways the past speaks to our choices today. When we talk of leadership, courage, and vision, let us not forget the kind of courage that says, this far, no farther. The most brilliant plans collapse on a slight miscalculation of a supply wagon, or a mistaken assumption about an opponent's willingness to suffer. Rapid success breeds dangerous confidence. The lesson of 1812 is not only military, it is organizational and ethical. It teaches prudence, the value of contrarian advice, the humility to accept that some objectives outstrip your capacity. Now, there are small stories that make the catastrophe painfully intimate. Think of Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, who led rearguard actions and literally carried the regimental eagle across rivers under fire. Picture General Jean-Baptiste Eblé, the engineer who, with a handful of men, built the bridges across the Berezina while standing waist-deep in freezing water. Men dropped dead in the river as they worked. Still they hammered onward. Eblé died of exposure a few days later. Or think of the nameless French corporal whose letter home read, "We have not eaten for 3 days," and then trails off into a sentence that never reaches father or mother. These are moments that tell you the cost not as a number, but as a human fracture. The aftermath reconfigured Europe. The capacity of coalition powers to rebuild losses meant that lengthy wars became sustainable to those states. Britain's financial power became more decisive than the tactical skill of any single field commander. The continental map redrew. The old order, which had been shaken by Napoleon's conquests, reasserted itself in new alignments. Russia, despite its own horrendous losses, emerged not exhausted but emboldened. Its influence on European affairs expanded. The continent that Napoleon had painted in French colors gradually reverted to a mosaic of states that negotiated at Vienna and attempted, in new ways, to avoid another century of such sweeping conflicts. So where does that leave us? 200 years on, we are left with bones under the earth, sometimes turned up by construction crews in Poland or Russia, by an occasional buckle, a corroded belt, a button. We are left with letters in museums that still smell faintly of old paper and sorrow. And we are left with the question of responsibility. How do we remember so that the dead compel action and not nostalgia? The act of remembrance is not simply about honoring, it is about learning. History, told honestly, is a discipline in humility. Leaders make errors. Their errors are not always visible until a campaign has ground into ruin. The story of the Grand Armée is therefore not just a tale of one man's failure, but a manual on how nations and commanders should think about capacity, about sustainable objectives, and about the human cost of choices. It is a cautionary tale for any time when ambition outstrips means. If I had to condense the lessons into a few clean lines, they would sound like this. First, logistics are strategy's quiet heart. Ignore them at your peril. Second, understanding the opponent's political and cultural capacity to suffer is crucial. Not all enemies end when their capital falls. Third, timeliness matters. A campaign's start and end dates are as strategic as any battle plan. Fourth, hubris and repetition of previously successful tactics can be fatal when conditions change. Fifth, the human cost is not a line item. It is the real ledger. But I want this to be more than a lecture. I want you to picture a returning soldier who arrives home in a village where the fields are the same, and the house is still the same. But he finds his brother is gone, and his father's eyesight is worse. Who will marry his fiancée? Who will plow the fields? The macro and micro join. The demographic aftershocks become questions about children who never existed, about economies that labored under fewer hands, about grief that reshaped families. The scale of suffering is hard to humanize, but it is essential that we try. Some final words on nuance. Not everything Napoleon did was folly. He reorganized legal codes, spread administrative reforms, and modernized institutions in ways that lasted. His military genius is real. He transformed how war would be fought. But genius cannot be an excuse for error. Magnificence and failure can live in the same life. The empire's reach included much that improved governance and much that destroyed lives. 2 centuries later, when archaeologists find buttons and buckles in the plowed earth of a Polish field, when a letter surfaced in a museum archive tells a single soldier's terror, those relics bridge us to the past. They are uncomfortable tokens. The world can be reshaped by choices, and choices can carry costs we pretend will be borne by someone else. The ghosts of 1812 teach us, if we will listen, that limits matter. If this story moved you, remember this small ethical test. When you see a leader drunk on success, when you see a movement pushing beyond capacity in the name of destiny, pause. Ask whether logistics match ambition, whether the human costs are acknowledged, whether dissenting voices are heard. That is an act of remembrance more potent than monuments. It says to the past we understood. It says to the future we intend otherwise. These men, more than 500,000 who never returned, deserve more than a simplified story. They deserve the complexity of their fate told in full. The decisions made in palaces and tents, the supply trains that failed, the disease that spread like a secret, the landscape stripped of life, the burning of Moscow, the freezing descent, the Beresina's desperate bridges, the surrender of will and the courage that shone in small acts. They deserve to be remembered as people, not statistics. If you want to carry this forward, read a letter from a conscript, visit a museum that preserves a soldier's gear, and think about the moral gravity of command. When leaders mistake the world for a chessboard and forget the people whose lives are the pieces, the cost becomes immeasurable. The Grand Armée's march into Russia is a ledger written in frieze and ash. It is the historical exemplar of what happens when ambition outruns capacity and compassion. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. It is long and it is brutal, but the truth rarely fits into sound bites. If it struck you, share it with someone who appreciates history told honestly, not only to understand what happened, but to understand why it matters. If you have thoughts on where you see the patterns of hubris today, I'd like to hear them. History doesn't lecture. It offers warning and reflection. The ghosts of 1812 are still very much with us, and the question they leave is not only what happened, but what will we do differently now?